There are lists and charts, discoveries praised as new, yet long before names and measures, there were fields, clay jars, and steady hands preparing what sustained life. This is not discovery. It is memory carried quietly across 5,000 years. Quinoa grew in the thin air of the Andes, where the ground was hard and the sky relentless. The Inca called it the mother of all grains, not because of what it contained, but because of what it gave: endurance at altitudes where breath itself became precious. It was sown in ceremony, harvested with reverence, and eaten by warriors before they climbed paths that would break lesser men. No one spoke of its completeness. They simply ate, and they endured. It sustained empires that rose in impossible places, and when the Spanish arrived, they saw only a crop. They could not see the quiet strength woven into every seed, but the people knew. And this is where the story begins. Amaranth was older still. The Aztecs ground it into dough, mixed it with honey, and shaped it into figures of their gods. To eat it was to consume something sacred, something that connected the body to forces beyond naming. It grew in fields that had been planted for 3,000 years, passed from generation to generation, never abandoned, never forgotten. When the conquistadors burned the amaranth fields, they were not destroying food. They were attempting to erase memory. But seeds, like stories, have a way of surviving. The plant returned quietly in the hands of those who remembered. And what it gave was not just sustenance, but a kind of resilience that could not be measured, only felt in the labor of those who depended on it. Buckwheat appeared in the cold valleys of Asia, in places where wheat would not grow and rice could not survive. It was the crop of last resort, the grain that thrived where others failed. And because of this, it was never celebrated, only relied upon. In the monasteries of Japan, monks ate soba noodles made from buckwheat before long meditations, not because they understood its properties, but because it steadied them. In Russia, it filled the bowls of peasants through winters that stretched into months of darkness. It was humble, unglamorous, and utterly dependable. No one wrote songs about buckwheat, but it kept people alive when nothing else would, and that was enough. Chia seeds were so small they could vanish in the palm of a hand, yet Aztec runners carried them across distances that would exhaust horses. A single spoonful mixed with water, and a man could run from sunrise to sunset without faltering. The Maya called them strength food, not because they transformed the body, but because they allowed it to endure beyond what seemed possible. Spanish chroniclers noted that warriors consumed chia before battle, and messengers before journeys that could span days. The seeds were currency, tribute, offering. They were woven into the survival of entire civilizations, not through force, but through quiet, unyielding endurance. And when the fields were burned, the knowledge of chia faded, but not entirely. Some things are too essential to disappear completely. Hemp seeds were pressed for oil in ancient China, scattered into soups in Tibet, ground into meal by those who worked the land and needed fuel that would last. It was not revered. It was not ceremonial. It was simply there, growing in fields alongside crops that required far more care, thriving in soil that had been neglected. Farmers ate it because it was easy to grow and hard to destroy, and because it gave them what they needed without asking much in return. In the high villages of the Himalayas, hemp porridge was a morning staple, eaten before long days of labor in thin air and bitter cold. No one praised it, but no one questioned it either. It did what it was supposed to do, quietly, without fanfare, generation after generation. Soybeans were planted in the Yellow River Valley more than 3,000 years ago, in fields that had been worked by hands long turned to dust. The Chinese did not eat them raw. They fermented them, pressed them, transformed them into forms that could be stored, carried, and consumed across seasons. Soy became miso. Soy became tempeh. Soy became the foundation of meals that fed emperors and laborers alike. It was not glamorous. It was not exotic. It was the backbone of survival in a land where famine was always one bad harvest away. And because it could be preserved, because it could endure, it became woven into the daily rhythm of life in ways that louder, brighter foods never could. Tofu appeared in the markets of Han Dynasty China, soft and unassuming, a food that could be shaped into anything or nothing at all. Buddhist monks ate it because it required no killing, and because it filled them without weighing them down. It spread along trade routes, carried by travelers who needed food that would not spoil, that could be prepared 100 different ways, that asked almost nothing of the body while giving much in return. It was not celebrated in poetry. It was not offered to gods. It was simply eaten. Day after day, by people who had learned that the quietest foods were often the most essential. And in that quiet persistence, tofu became part of the foundation of entire cultures. Tempeh was born in the villages of Java, wrapped in banana leaves and left to ferment in the heat. It was not invented by scholars or chefs, it was discovered by necessity, by people who needed soybeans to last longer, to carry further, to feed more mouths with less. The fermentation transformed it, made it denser, deeper, more sustaining. Indonesian farmers ate it before working fields that stretched into jungle heat, and it held them through labor that would break those unaccustomed to it. It was never fancy, it was never rare. It was the food of common people, and because of that, it endured in ways that royal feasts never could. What sustained the many outlasts what delighted the few. Edamame was harvested young, before the soybeans hardened, and eaten by hand in the fields of Japan. It was a snack, a pause in labor, something to eat between tasks when hunger was immediate and time was short. No one thought of it as protein. No one thought of it as complete. They thought of it as a moment of relief, a small green pod that could be cracked open and consumed without preparation, without ceremony. It appeared in tea houses, in markets, in the hands of children who had been working since dawn. It was ordinary, and in its ordinariness, it became woven into the texture of daily life in ways that no banquet dish ever could. Lentils were among the first crops ever cultivated, planted in the Fertile Crescent when agriculture itself was still being imagined. They appeared in the stews of Egyptian laborers, in the pots of Roman soldiers, in the meals of Persian travelers crossing deserts that stretched beyond sight. They required almost nothing. No wealth, no skill, no special knowledge. They simply needed to be soaked, boiled, and eaten. And because they were so simple, they became essential. Entire civilizations rose on the backs of lentils, eaten by people who never knew they were consuming something complete, something that held within it all the elements the body required to endure. They ate and they survived, and that was the only measure that mattered. Chickpeas appeared in clay jars in the markets of Mesopotamia, ground into flour by the Phoenicians, roasted and eaten by travelers crossing the trade routes that connected empires. They were humble, round, unremarkable, but they could be stored for years, carried across oceans, planted in poor soil, and still yield a harvest. In the villages of the Middle East, chickpeas became hummus, falafel, stews that simmered for hours and fed families through seasons of scarcity. No one called them superfoods. No one wrote treatises on their virtues. They were simply there, dependable, enduring, woven into the fabric of survival in a way that required no explanation. Black beans filled the clay pots of Mesoamerica long before the word protein existed in any language. The Maya ate them with corn, not because they understood complementary nutrition, but because the combination worked, because it sustained them through labor that lasted from dawn until the light failed. The beans were dried, stored, carried across distances, planted in soil that had been cultivated for 1,000 years. They were not exotic, they were not rare, they were the foundation, the constant, the meal that appeared again and again because it did what was needed without requiring celebration. And in that quiet reliability, they became sacred in a way no ritual could match. Kidney beans simmered in the cooking pots of ancient India, of Egypt, of Rome, appearing in disparate places, at disparate times, always offering the same quiet sustenance. They required patience. They could not be rushed. Soaked overnight, boiled slowly, they transformed from hard stones into something soft, filling, enduring. They fed laborers building monuments that would stand for millennia, soldiers marching distances that would exhaust modern armies, mothers nursing children through seasons when other foods failed. No one praised kidney beans, but no one survived without them either. And in that unspoken dependence lay a kind of reverence deeper than any spoken blessing. Mung beans sprouted in the heat of South Asia, small and green and impossibly prolific. They could be eaten whole, split, sprouted, ground into flour. Ayurvedic practitioners prescribed them not as medicine, but as balance, as something that cooled the body without depleting it, that nourished without overwhelming. In the villages of India and China, mung bean soup was what you ate when recovering from illness, when the body needed gentleness and strength in equal measure. It was not dramatic, it was not transformative, it was restorative in the quietest sense, the food that brought people back to themselves without force, without fanfare, simply by being exactly what it was. Peas grew in the gardens of ancient Greece, in the fields of medieval Europe, in the monasteries where monks cultivated them alongside prayers. They were planted between other crops, filling spaces that would otherwise lie fallow, making use of soil that had already given much. Pea soup fed peasants through winters when meat was unthinkable and bread was scarce. Dried peas could last years, could be carried in sacks across long journeys, could be planted and harvested by children too young for heavier labor. They were ordinary. They were everywhere. And because they were everywhere, they became invisible. The kind of food so essential that no one thought to celebrate it until it was gone. Spirulina floated in the lakes of the Aztecs, harvested with fine nets and dried into cakes that could be stored and carried. The people around Lake Texcoco called it tecuitlatl, and they ate it with corn, not because they understood its density of nutrition, but because it was there, abundant, and it gave them what they needed. When the Spanish arrived, they noted the practice with confusion and then dismissal. The lakes were drained, the harvesting stopped. Spirulina faded from memory, surviving only in the mouths of those who remembered the old ways. It was rediscovered centuries later, praised as a modern superfood, as if it had been invented rather than forgotten. But the Aztecs had known. They had always known. Barley was ground into bread in Mesopotamia before wheat became king, before empires decided what grains would carry prestige and which would be relegated to peasants and livestock. The Sumerians brewed it into beer, the Egyptians baked it into loaves, the Greeks fed it to athletes preparing for the ancient games. It grew in soil too poor for wheat, in climates too harsh for rice. And because it endured where others failed, it was always there. In the background, unglamorous, essential. When combined with legumes in the stews of the ancient world, it gave something more than the sum of its parts, though no one spoke of it in those terms. They simply ate and worked and endured. Wheat had to be transformed to unlock its deepest strength. The ancients knew this instinctively, even if they lacked the language to explain why. Bread made from wheat soaked, fermented, leavened slowly over days. This was not convenience, but necessity discovered through trial and long memory. In the villages of the Levant, women ground wheat into flour and mixed it with water days before baking, allowing fermentation to break down what the body could not. The result was bread that sustained prophets wandering deserts, laborers raising temples, families surviving winters that seemed endless. It was not the wheat alone. It was the preparation, the patience, the knowledge passed quietly from hand to hand. Rice and beans appeared together not by accident, but by instinct refined over centuries of hunger and survival. In the Caribbean, in Central America, in the kitchens of those who had little and needed everything from what little they had, the pairing became gospel. Rice alone was not enough. Beans alone left something missing. But together in the same pot, eaten from the same bowl, they became complete in a way that satisfied not just hunger, but something deeper, the body's unspoken knowing of what it required. No one explained it. No one needed to. The combination simply worked, meal after meal, generation after generation, until it became inseparable from survival itself. Corn and beans grew in the same fields in Mesoamerica, the corn stalks rising tall while the beans climbed them, their roots feeding the soil that fed them both. The three sisters, they were called: corn, beans, and squash, planted together because they thrived together, because separating them made no sense. The people who ate them understood, without needing to articulate it, that corn and beans together gave something neither could give alone. The nixtamalization of corn, soaking it in lime water, unlocked nutrients the body could actually use. And when combined with beans, the meal became foundation. It sustained the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca. It sustained entire ways of life. Sesame seeds were pressed into oil in the Indus Valley 5,000 years ago, scattered onto bread in ancient Babylon, ground into tahini in the markets of Assyria. They were so small they seemed almost insignificant, yet from them came richness, depth, a kind of enduring energy that carried people through labor and long journeys. In the Middle East, sesame was woven into daily meals so thoroughly that its absence would have been unthinkable. Halva, tahini, bread crusted with seeds, these were not luxuries. They were constants. And in that constancy lay a quiet strength that required no explanation, no justification, only the steady repetition of preparation and consumption across millennia. Pumpkin seeds were scooped from harvested squash and dried in the sun across the Americas, eaten by hand, ground into sauces, pressed for oil. The Aztecs called them pepitas and consumed them for endurance, though they did not use that word. They simply knew that the seeds, eaten regularly, allowed the body to do what was required of it. In the high deserts and fertile valleys alike, Pumpkin seeds became part of the rhythm of survival. Harvested, stored, eaten through seasons when fresh food was memory. They were never the meal itself, but they appeared alongside the meal, adding something essential without demanding attention. Flaxseed was cultivated in ancient Babylon, in the Nile Valley, in the cold climates of northern Europe, where it became both food and fabric. The seeds were ground and mixed into bread, soaked into porridge, consumed by those who worked the land and needed fuel that would sustain them through long, cold days. Charlemagne considered flax so essential, he passed laws requiring its cultivation. It was not about flavor, it was about endurance. The seeds gave something the body recognized, even if the mind could not name it. A kind of fortification against the relentless demands of labor and survival. And because it was reliable, it became woven into the foundation of daily life. Almonds grew in the groves of the Mediterranean, eaten by Persian kings and Roman soldiers alike. They could be carried without spoiling, consumed without preparation, stored through seasons and still retain their strength. Travelers crossing deserts packed almonds because they knew, through experience passed down across generations, that a handful could sustain them when nothing else was available. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, almonds were ground into milk for days of fasting, providing sustenance without breaking religious law. They were expensive, yes, but also essential. A food that gave much while asking little, that could be eaten alone or woven into meals that fed multitudes. Walnuts grew in the mountains of Persia, in the forests of ancient China, in the groves that marked the edges of civilizations. The Greeks called them food for the gods, not because they were divine, but because they seemed to carry within them a kind of concentrated vitality that other foods lacked. Persian warriors ate them before battle. Chinese scholars consumed them before long hours of study. And in the quiet villages between empires, families cracked walnuts by firelight and ate them through winters when other foods had long since run out. They were rich, dense, enduring. They gave the body what it needed to continue, to endure, to survive one more day, one more season, one more generation. The secret was never hidden, only forgotten beneath modern noise. These foods sustained civilizations not through miracles, but quiet sufficiency. Perhaps that is the lesson. If this resonated, subscribe. There is more wisdom waiting quietly to be remembered again.